Well, hey, all you wiretappers. Good to be back here in the studio, Gangland Wire. This is Gary Jenkins, retired Kansas City, Missouri police detective, formerly of the Intelligence Unit. I spent 14 years there investigating organized crime in Kansas City. Best 14 years of my life, I think. Sometimes, I've got this true crime podcast, and we focus on the mob. And I haven't been to Chicago for a little bit, it seemed like. And I was looking through some stuff from the Chicago Outfit Facebook page, and there's a newspaper clip on the group that has newspaper clips on it that had an article by a man named Drew Pearson. Now, Drew Pearson was a real famous columnist back in the 40s and 50s, and the title of it is "A Songbird Who Sang Murdered." Now, he starts off talking about the singing of Joe Valachi. I guess he wrote this article about the time Joe Valachi hit all the newspapers and talked about the New York mob, but he had a guy who talked about the Chicago outfit. He said that he said that he felt responsible for the death of this informant out of Chicago. So he said he dropped into the morgue of Chicago's American newspaper to refresh his memory just about this guy and what he said. This guy was a man named James Ragen, who was a head of the Continental Press and Racing Wire. He was machine gunned down from a fruit truck on August 14th, 1946. Reagan, before he died, had told him many things. In 1946, 4 years before the Kefauver Commission and just before he got killed, Reagan told Drew Pearson about the Chicago mob rule and gave him permission to take it to the Attorney General of the United States, Tom Clark. Now, Tom Clark is the same guy who commuted the sentences of the four Chicago outfit bosses who were given 10-year prison sentences for the Hollywood scandal, for trying to extort money from Hollywood unions and Hollywood film companies. Now, this story that he told was about hotels and taverns and nightclubs and restaurants, and he said they're all dominated by the mob in Chicago. He said to hire a bartender to buy ice cubes or to launder roller towels. Those are the old towels that you used to pull down in the bathrooms. I don't think they have them anymore. And they take those towels out and send them off, and they'd launder them and give you a fresh one. To buy any beer to replenish your alcohol supply in a bar, you had to do business with the mob. The mob ruled a very large part of Chicago. He took this story back to Attorney General Clark, who authorized a dozen or so FBI men to check on Reagan's facts. A couple of weeks later, they reported back, and he said, this is all true. They also reported that the control of the underworld reached into very high places in Chicago and political places, and in Illinois, too. Also to Tom Clark, although nobody really knew that at the time, and only indirectly. Some of these rules of the underworld in Chicago were, on the surface, respected businessmen and politicians whose names were household words in Chicago. Some of them had reformed, but they still controlled the mob. Which means that they maybe didn't go out and do mob stuff anymore, but they still had some control in the mob. In some respects, Reagan's information was much more important than that of Joe Valachi, especially when it came to Chicago. Valachi didn't know anything about Chicago, didn't talk about Chicago. But the Justice Department in Washington had no jurisdiction at the time, which is kind of interesting. They had to pass a lot of special laws in order to bring the feds in or catch these guys on some kind of a interstate violation. Now, they just didn't want to do it because they had interstate theft at that time. There's a lot of things they could do, transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. They could use the interstate transportation of stolen autos. There was all kinds of stuff they could use, but they wouldn't use it. Claimed this states' rights. City of Chicago and state of Illinois were responsible, not the FBI or the Justice Department. Now, ain't that something? They claimed they had no responsibility for all this crime going on in Chicago. A lot different than it is today. The feds are trying to send the National Guard in and all the new federal police and newly hired federal police into Chicago to clean up Chicago. So back then, they didn't want anything to do with Chicago. He called Drew Pearson back a little later, shortly after, and there was a leaky place up there in Washington. He said the mob was wise to him. They were out to get him, and he asked for FBI protection. The FBI did give him a bodyguard for a short period of time, but that didn't last. And Reagan himself was not exactly a saint. He was the boss of the Continental Racing Wire, and he distributed racing results. And there was a huge amount of gambling in all the different cities that was ran by the mob. And the results came over this Continental Racing Wire immediately. You could have a race in upstate Saratoga, and when that race was done, the results were sent back to Chicago and Kansas City and Baltimore and Cleveland and all those states. And he was involved with a mob associate named Mo Annenberg in distributing this news to gamblers all over the country. He'd actually had some minor altercations with this Mo Annenberg, who was definitely a mob associate, when Annenberg wanted to increase the race wire tolls to some certain publications that weren't kicking back to the mob. He wanted to almost triple them from $200 a week to $500 a week. And these troubles really began because Chicago mob had started their own racing wire that was going to compete with them. And you just don't compete with the Chicago outfit on a business level. You just don't compete with them. Couple of names. He said Jaime Levin and Greasy Thumb Jake Guzik directed that battle to take over the race wire. And the former Illinois state senator involved, Pat Burns. He was working for the mob, acquired property over the tracks where men with binoculars could flash the odds and the race results to offices, which then in turn sent them out over the wire to bookmakers all over the country. And Reagan's Continental Wire was already doing the same thing. And the take on this was fabulous for the mob, and the mob demanded that Reagan move over and let them have it all. The mob, you just don't, if they want to move in, they're going to take it all. They're always going to take it all. Probably that's what induced Reagan to talk to him, Drew Pearson opines, and because he had threats on his life even before this, and I think he thought maybe he could bring a lot of federal heat onto the mob in Chicago that then would back them off from trying to take over the race wire business. It's a way to use the FBI or the police to take out competition. Really, it's probably what it really comes down to. What it really was. Drew Pearson says, when a man calls you on the phone and tells you in detail about one time he found two gunmen laying outside his home waiting for him to come out, he tries to do something about it, and that's when he called the FBI. And they said manpower's short, we got other problems to handle, and Reagan kept calling Drew Pearson and kept calling, saying, my life's in danger. And Drew Pearson knew he was telling the truth. Reagan finally hired two bodyguards, what he should have done all on his own before, a retired policeman named Walter Peltier and a truck driver named Marty Walsh. The retired policeman might be okay, although that would be suspect with the mob in Chicago. He'd just as soon turn him over for a little more money as guard him, I got a feeling. 2 months after Reagan talked to Drew Pearson, he was driving home about 5:30 in the afternoon. A gray sedan with Indiana plates stopped in front of him in Pershing Road and State Street. The traffic light turned, and the two bodyguards were following him closely behind. They expected trouble, but not till they got home and not in broad daylight on the streets of Chicago, downtown Chicago with all the traffic around. Well, a fruit truck, a light delivery truck with crates of fruit on it, and a tarpaulin across the top pulled up alongside Reagan at this light. All of a sudden, the tarpaulin was pulled aside. This is like TV, folks. Machine guns thrust out, and bam, bam, bam. I mean, they fired off round after round into Reagan's car. Light changed, and the fruit truck and the gray sedan moved on out. Reagan was taken immediately to a hospital, and he was still alive, and he was kind of philosophical, according to Drew Pearson. He says, well, I guess if they want you, they're going to get you. This was not the end of the story, though. Reagan began to recover from the mob's bullets. 3 Chicago cops had sat in shifts outside his hospital room, one on each shift. And so, they couldn't finish the job in the hospital room, and Reagan got better and better. But then finally, on August 14th, this is about, 2 months later, he dies. The autopsy showed that there was a tube of mercury had been placed inside his stomach, enough to kill 3 men. Now, go figure. Have you ever heard of that? They placed it out. Somehow they placed a tube of mercury in his stomach. I guess he through some of the wounds he had or something. They must have had a doctor involved. I'm not sure how that happened. That's That's a weird one there, folks. That is something else. Any of you guys ever heard anything more strange than that? Let me know. But put a tube of mercury in his stomach. Crazy. The coroner ruled that he could not charge murder since he couldn't say whether Reagan had died of gunshot wounds or of mercury poisoning. I think you'd charge murder either way. Well, it sounded like the coroner was on the take, too. You know, the outfit had Chicago wired in most of the political offices in 1946, 47, 48, clear up to really up to the 70s, and Operation Greylord started knocking some of that out. They don't know. They just don't know whether some mobster came in there and or they bribed somebody, but more than likely they bribed somebody to get that tube of mercury in his stomach. Death of James N. Ragen remains one of Chicago's 974 unsolved gangland slayings since 1919, and that this was back in the 50s or so when this article was written. So that's the end of James Ragen and the end of his wire service, the Continental Press and Racing Wire, and the total domination of Chicago of the wire services, especially west of New York. I mean, Chicago, they wanted to rule everything west of New York, and they did. So, anyhow, if you got any other old stories like that that are kind of interesting, let me know. I'm putting this up as a little bonus episode. I really appreciate y'all tuning in. Don't forget, I got books and movies out there to sell. Go to my website or go to Amazon. Just search for Gary Jenkins. You might want to take a look at the VA website if you've been in the service and you think you have a problem with PTSD or alcoholism or anything like that. If you have a problem with gambling, 1-800 bets off or whatever your state has, all the gambling casinos in the United States, whenever they get awarded a gambling license, they have to kick in so much money to provide services for people with problems with gambling. If you have problems with alcoholism straight, well, you know, our friend Anthony Ruggiano, he's got a website out there. Just go to his website and there's a way to contact him on that. I sometimes say a number. I'm not sure if that number is still any good. And I guess that's all I got. Thanks a lot, guys.